Hi, welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video we're going to learn the 2 to 4 player game Warhammer Underworlds Shadespire, published by Games Workshop. Shadespire used to be a majestic mirrored city filled with treasures and secrets, but then it was set upon by the Lord of Undeath who cursed it, and it's laid in ruins for thousands of years. But still, warriors and adventurers have come seeking its mysteries, and others have become trapped there through ill-gotten fates. No matter how you ended up in Shadespire, it's going to require a fight to get out. So join me at the table and let's learn how to play. Shadespire comes with 2 teams of miniatures, but you'll find they're on sprues when you open the box. And if assembling miniatures concerns you, let me give you a quick overview of the process for putting them together so you'll have confidence to do this for yourself. You may even find it's not as difficult as you first thought. Each team is on its own colored sprues, Stormcast Eternals in blue and the Bloodbound in red. You'll also find a double-sided assembly guide in the box which shows how each figure goes together and the numbered pieces that it uses. For example, let's assemble figure 1 that uses piece 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Looking at this blue sprue, you'll also find those parts clearly numbered here on the edges as 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Now we need to clip those pieces out using a tool like this, which is not included but can be found in hobby or even hardware stores. You simply place the flat edge against the part of the miniature that you're keeping and then cut to separate it from the sprue. Now pay careful attention to areas like this because these pegs coming out of the feet are part of the miniature. You don't want to accidentally cut them off as they'll be used in assembling the figure. So just cut beneath them. And once you've cut all the necessary areas, the piece will pop off of the sprue just like this. This next step isn't necessary, but if you feel you have some rough areas from where you clipped, you can scrape them off using a sharp edge like this just to clean off those spots. I recommend detaching all of one figure's pieces, like I've done here, and then stopping to assemble it so you don't accidentally mix the miniature's parts up with the parts from another figure. From this point on, we just follow the instructions as shown here, and I should point out that no glue is required. These are push-fit miniatures that will stay together when snapped into place. But if you doubt me, you can use some plastic glue if you'd like to touch a small bit to the connecting areas before pressing the pieces together. But as you can see, without that, everything comes together just like it should. Once you've finished, you'll have a highly detailed miniature that looks just like this. You'll then follow the process I just showed for each miniature until you've completed all of them. And in the description of this video, you'll find a link to the Shadespire website, which provides even more detailed instructions on assembling your miniatures and guides for painting them, along with previews of the other warbands releasing for this game. Now, for some people, painting miniatures is a creative and rewarding part of a game like this, but it's not required, because either way, you'll have no trouble distinguishing the miniatures one from another, and each warband comes in its own color. But now, with our figures assembled, let's learn how to play. First, the players perform a roll-off, which means they each take any 4 dice and roll them. The player who gets the most of these exclamation mark critical symbols will win. And if there's a tie, they both continue to re-roll until the tie is broken. The loser of the roll-off picks one of these double-sided boards and places it with the side face-up of their choosing. Then the other player chooses the other board side that they want and places it so that either the long or short edges are connected. If connecting on the short edges, at least 2 of these half hexes must be joined together. So that means they're always going to be flush like this. Or of course, you can rotate either of the boards as well. When joining on the long sides, at least 3 of these half hexes must be connected, so you could have these offset in a number of different ways. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to join them together like this. Now find the double-sided objective tokens numbered 1 through 5. We're going to be setting up a 2-player game in this video, and the objectives numbered 6 to 9 are only used in games with more players, so these can be returned to the box. The objectives that you kept, you'll now flip face down and shuffle into a new pile. Whichever player chose the first game board then takes the top token and without looking at its number, places it face down into any empty hex. Except for those that would show this symbol, or within ones with thick white borders, or these half hexes that line the outside of the board. Half hexes that have been joined together to create whole ones like these can have objective tokens placed into them. You also can't place objectives into any edge hex, which are these full hexes that go around the outside border of the battlefield. After an objective has been placed, players take turns putting the others into play. But each new objective cannot be placed within 2 spaces of another objective. So this one here is within 2 hexes of this other objective, so it would need to be put further away. The final objective follows the same rules as the other ones, except this one can be placed into an edge hex if you like. Once all of the objectives have been placed, you'll flip them face up like this so their number side is revealed. By the board, you'll place the game's other tokens separated into their own piles. But to make it easier for me to move things around on the table during this video, I'll keep these off screen and just bring them back out as necessary. Each player now takes 4 of these activation tokens and one of these 2 separately bundled cards, which come shrink-wrapped in the game. You'll remove the placeholder cards on top, and then we'll take this one and hand the other to our opponent. You'll find cards for each of the miniatures in your warband, which are also pictured here in the upper left-hand corner. These should be placed face up in front of you, as none of the information on these is meant to be kept hidden. And they're also double-sided, so make sure that the gray bordered side is face up initially. Also in your pack are 2 decks which you can separate by their backs and shuffle into face-down piles in front of yourself. These are the objective and power cards. The game also comes with an extra pack of cards that allows you to custom build your own decks, following these instructions here in the rulebook, which I'll leave you to discover on your own. Essentially, you'll be able to change the kinds of powers and abilities that you can provide to your warband while playing, and even change the types of objectives that you'll be working towards. For your first game, though, I recommend starting with the basic decks. From these, you'll now draw 3 objectives and 5 power cards into your hand, keeping them secret from the other players. And after taking this initial hand, you can discard all of your objectives or all of your power cards or everything, and then redraw what you discarded. But just know you can only do this once. Now the players will roll off again, and the winner will choose which player puts one of their fighters onto the board first. Then players will go back and forth, placing figures until all of them are in play. And if one player has more figures than the other, like we have here, it might result in one person placing a few figures back to back at the end. When you put a figure onto the board, it must be placed into a hex showing this starting symbol within that player's territory. Your territory is made up of the hexes on the board that you chose during the setup. Any hexes that were created by the boards being joined together, however, are considered no one's territory. It might look something like this once the players have finished putting their figures onto the board. And that's the setup. In Shadespire, you'll win by having the most glory at the end of the game. But defeating your opponent isn't the only option. You'll also have objective cards in hand that will provide you with alternative ways to gain glory. The game is played over 3 rounds, and each round is broken into an action and an end phase. So let's go back to the table, and we'll see how an action phase works. First, the players will perform a normal roll-off, but the person who finished placing their warband first will add 1 critical symbol to their roll, or any rerolls if there's ties. So if we assume this player was getting the bonus critical symbol, then they would win. That winner then decides who goes first. In this phase, each player takes turns performing a single activation, starting with whoever the first player ended up being, and then going back and forth until each have performed 4. To help you keep track of this, a player flips over one of these tokens after performing their activation. To complete an activation, you pick one of 8 possible actions, and while most of them will involve using one of your figures, not all of them do. So let's go back to the table and we'll learn how each of these actions work. One option is to move, and to do this, you pick any one of your fighters and check their movement value shown here. So Bright Shield has a movement of 3. A fighter may move in any direction through adjacent spaces a number of times up to that movement value, but they may not move through these half spaces that border the battlefield, or through other figures, even friendly ones, or through spaces that have these thicker white borders. Also, each fighter may only move once per round. So after taking this action, place one of these tokens by it as a reminder that it may not move again. After performing an activation like this, I would flip over one of my activation tokens, and then a power step would occur, which we'll learn about later. And then the next player would perform an activation. Maybe they'd also move using this figure, which has a movement of 4. They too would then have to place one of these tokens and flip over one of their activations. Another power step would occur, and then it would be my turn again. As before, I can pick any figure to use for my activation, even this one. I just can't move with it because of this token. But I'll pick it again anyway and show you another action instead, attacking. To do this, first pick an attack action available to your chosen fighter, which are found within these darkened rows like this. Some fighters will have more than one row to choose from, and upgrades, that we'll learn about later, can add them as well. But you still only get to pick one of these lines when you perform an attack. In this case, we'll use the Sigmarite hammer. Then you pick your target, which must be within your attack's range, which is represented by the value here. A 1 means the target must be adjacent to you, while a 2, like this attack has, means the target could be up to 2 spaces away, and so on. You also have to have line of sight to your target. To check this, you draw an imaginary line from the center of your space to the center of the space containing your target. If that line would go through or touch any blocked space or leave the board, you don't have a valid target. Keep in mind that objective tokens or other figures do not block line of sight, so this would be a valid target for this player's attack. Now, if this had been here instead, it would no longer be a valid target because the straight line would touch the edge of this blocked space, which would then prevent line of sight. Returning to our previous example, we do have a valid target here. So now you would roll a number of white dice equal to your attack statistic, which is this second value. Every symbol that you roll that matches the one showing with that value will count as a success. So in this case, we have 1 success. If you roll this symbol, it's known as a critical success and also counts as a hit, no matter what symbol is showing here. And critical rolls like this can increase the effect of your attack, as we'll see. But first, your opponent must roll a number of black dice equal to the defense value shown here on the targeted figure. Now, if you had seen a shield, like this character has, it means these sides will count as successes. But an arrow, like this, means this side is required instead. But in either case, critical symbols on this die also count as a success as well. Whether attacking or defending, sometimes these symbols, known as supports, will count as successes as well. To see how they work, you count up how much support each of the figures in the fight has. The attacker gets 1 point of support for every friendly fighter that is adjacent to their target. So in this new example, the Stormcast here, attacking this Bloodbound, would have 2 supports. Meanwhile, the defender gets a point of support for each friendly fighter adjacent to the attacking fighter. So in this case, the defender has 2 points of support. Now you compare those support points. If it's a tie, nothing changes. However, if you have exactly 1 more point of support than the other player, which Bright Shield would get if this figure wasn't here, then you would count these symbols as successes on your rolled dice. If you have 2 or more points of support compared to the other player, you also count these symbols as successes. But with that understood, let's go back to this original example, and then after calculating your total successes, you compare the results. So in this case, the attacker has 2 successes and the defender has 1. If the attack total is greater than the defense, the target takes a number of these wound tokens equal to the damage values shown here on the attack line, and these are placed on that figure's card. After this, the target can then be driven back. This gives the attacker the option to push the target 1 space away from their figure if they want. So the figure could not be pushed to here, because then the fighter wouldn't be any further away. But we could choose any one of these 3 spaces. If there wasn't a valid space to push the figure into, then it would just stay put. If the attack total is less than the defense value, as we see now, the attack action instead fails and nothing happens. The attack is also a failure if the results are tied with 0 successes each. If the attack and defense totals are tied on anything other than 0 successes, here we see they have 1 success each, the attacker still fails to do damage, but they can then choose to drive the defender back, as we explained earlier. However, in this specific outcome, again, a tied result with higher than 0 successes, if there wasn't a valid space to drive the defender into because they were all occupied or blocked, then the attack is a success and damage would be applied as normal. Critical successes like these can also change the outcome of a fight. Now, if players are tied for critical successes, then nothing changes and you just resolve things as we explained previously. However, if the attacker has more critical successes than the defender, then no matter what the defender rolled, the attack is a success. In this case, the defender has rolled 2 successes, and we'll say the attacker only rolled this 1 critical success. In this case, the attack still succeeds. Some attacks will also have bonus effects listed, so keep an eye out for those as well. On the other hand, if the defender has more critical successes than the attacker, again, no matter what else was rolled, the attack fails and the target cannot be driven back. So in this case, even though the attacker has more successes, the defender has more criticals overall and takes no damage. If you're curious, these are all 6 sides of each of the 2 types of dice found in the game, if you'd like to get a sense of the odds of rolling certain results. If a fighter ever sustains damage equal to or greater than its wound characteristic here, they are taken out of action by removing them and any of their tokens from the battlefield. The other player then gains one of these glory point tokens. Now, we'll see later how you might be able to play cards from your hand, and if you had one that could save a fighter before they are taken out of action, then your opponent does not gain the glory token. Some attacks have special keywords as well. For example, if it has Cleave, then the target cannot count shield symbols as successes. An attack might have Knockback, like this, which includes a value, where that number is the additional spaces a target can be driven back if the attack roll had been successful. And the attack being successful is key, because remember, although you can drive a figure back, if the attack and defense is tied, that's not considered a successful attack, and so you can't use Knockback in that situation. If the attack is successful and Knockback applies, the extra spaces the figure is moved in must be in the same direction as any it was just pushed from either being driven back or other knockback points that you are spending. Pushes like this are not considered moves, so if a figure is driven or knocked back, it does not add a move token to its base. Also, you can't be pushed through other figures or blocked spaces, so if this would happen, the knockback just stops short. I should also mention that an attack's ability might let you target more than one fighter with a single attack action, in which case you resolve them separately, rolling dice for each, in the order of your choosing, but it still only counts as a single activation. Alright, so now let's take a look at some of the other actions that you can take when performing an activation. Instead of moving or attacking, you can do both at once with a charge. First, you'll move with your chosen figure, following the rules that we learned before, which means that you cannot charge with a fighter if it already has one of these tokens. And following that movement, you must be within range and line of sight of a valid target and able to make an attack. If there are no valid targets, then you cannot charge. However, after the attack is resolved, you'll then take one of these tokens and flip it to this side, which means that this figure cannot be activated again during this round. That is, they can't be targeted to do anything that would flip another of your activation tokens. Now that said, if they have an ability that can trigger outside of using one of your activations, those can still be resolved. Another action you can take is to go on guard by placing this token by one of your fighters. This guard effect will remain active until the end of that action phase, but it's also cancelled if you would make a charge with that figure. While active, if that fighter is attacked, both shield and arrow symbols will count as successes when defending. Though remember, if hit with the Cleave effect, shield symbols in that case still won't block it. Another action you can instead take when activating are ones named on cards, including upgrades. We'll learn more about these later, but basically these can be added to your fighter during the game. When taking an activation, instead of using a fighter, you can just draw a power card from the top of your deck. And I should mention that you can have any number of these during the game. Alternatively, you could use your activation to first discard an objective card and then draw a new one. Just keep in mind that most you can only have 3 objectives at a time. And if either of your 2 decks would run out, note that you cannot draw any more of that card since these are never reshuffled. Finally, instead of doing any of the previously discussed actions, you can just pass for your activation, and that will still flip one of these tokens over. Now, after a player has finished performing whatever action they're going to take, it is then the power step. This is an opportunity for players to go back and forth, playing power cards from their hand one at a time. And you'll start with the player who just finished taking the action. They can choose to either play one power card or pass. Then the next player has the same options. And then going back to the other player, even if they passed, they could still play a card at that time. You go back and forth like this until both players back to back pass without playing anything. So just keep in mind, again, after every activation, there's a power step. So let's go back to the table and I'll show you some of the different kinds of cards that you can play. Cards with a sword in this corner are known as ploys, and when played, you resolve their effect here and then discard them. And some might even allow you to perform a move or attack, and if so, this doesn't cost an activation, and you can even pick a figure with one of these tokens already on them. Now, if there is a condition printed on the ploy, then you must be able to fulfill it. For example, Confusion here says that you must pick 2 fighters that are adjacent to each other. So if no fighters are adjacent in the battlefield, you could not play this particular ploy. Sometimes an effect will refer to the next time something would happen. For example, Unstoppable Strike says the first attack action in the next activation will gain Cleave. In those cases, it's helpful to instead place the card face up in the battle area as a reminder until it triggers, and then you can discard it. If the triggering effect never happens, then the card is automatically discarded at the end of the round or sooner if it indicates otherwise. For example, the attack that would trigger this effect would have to happen during the next activation. If the power card you played shows this gear in the upper left-hand corner, then it's an upgrade. To play one of these in the power step, you must have at least 1 glory point face up like this, and then to play it, you flip one face down. This doesn't reduce how much glory you've collected, it just keeps track of how many upgrades you could still play. The upgrade is then assigned to any one of your fighters, unless it must go with a specific one, which will be indicated right here. Either way, over the course of the game, assuming you can pay for them, you can assign any number of appropriate upgrades to a single fighter. Some effects on ploys in your hand or on your character's cards will include the keyword reaction. This means that the ploy or effect can be played as soon as its listed condition happens during the game, and this does not cost you an activation. Unless the effect states otherwise, it will happen immediately after the activation or action that triggered it, even before the power step. Now, it is possible that more than one player will want to play a reaction at the same time. However, in response to any particular action happening in the game, at most only one reaction can be resolved. So to determine who gets to play their reaction, it's always the person who would next get to activate that can react first. And if they choose not to, then the other player can instead. After the reaction is resolved, you pick up where you left off. However, if the reaction changed things in such a way that the previously resolving action can no longer happen, then the action is canceled. For example, if this figure was attacking the enemy here, but then a reaction was played that moved this figure, the attack action would be canceled, but that player's activation would still be flipped over. One other thing I should point out is that each figure will have one of these golden Inspire boxes on them. And when this condition becomes true, its card is immediately flipped over. This removes the Inspire condition, but leaves you with a better version of that fighter in some way. And with that, we've covered the action phase, where players will take turns going back and forth, performing one activation until they've each performed 4. And don't forget, after each of those activations, there's also a power step. Then it's time for the end phase, and this will be fully completed one at a time by each player, starting with the player who took the first activation during the action phase. They first check the objective cards they have in hand, and if they met any of the listed conditions, then those are revealed, and they collect the indicated number of glory tokens, placing them face up in front of themselves, and then discarding those objectives. Any they have remaining in hand, they can keep until the next round, or discard if they want to. The conditions of objectives are clearly explained on them, but if one refers to holding an objective, it just means that you have a figure on that numbered token at this time. Some objectives will have conditions that allow them to be scored during the action phase, in which case they can be resolved at that time, and you'll collect the glory tokens and discard it. Then immediately draw a new objective so that you still have 3 in hand. If you do score an objective during the action phase, and the new one that you draw can also be scored during the action phase, and you already satisfy its conditions, you cannot resolve it right away. You have to wait until at least your next activation, because an objective that you've just drawn cannot be played during the same turn. Going back to the end phase, after you've completed and or discarded any number of objectives, you may now play any number of upgrade cards, assuming you can pay for them by flipping over glory tokens. But you cannot play ploy cards in this phase. Then any amount of power cards you still have in hand can be discarded. And if necessary, you'll now draw new objectives until you have 3, and power cards until you have 5, just like at the beginning of the game. And if your decks would ever run out, you just take as many as you can. Now the other player follows the same sequence, and then the round is over and you'll start a new one. In the end phase of the second round, you'll do the same steps again, but in the end phase of the third round, all you have to do is complete objectives. You don't need to discard and redraw cards because at that point, the game is over. Now, whoever has the most glory tokens face up or down wins. But if there was a tie, and one of the player's fighters have all been taken out, the other player wins. If there's a tie, but both warbands still have fighters in play, then the person whose figures are currently holding the most objectives wins. However, if there's still a tie, then the game ends in a draw. I should point out it is possible to eliminate an enemy's warband before the end of the third round. And if that happens, you still continue to play out any remaining activations, phases, and even other rounds, especially those end phases, because it's possible that both players could still be completing objectives. Remember, you don't win by eliminating a player's warband. You win by having the most glory. The rules also include instructions for competitive play and a King of the Hill type mode that uses this artifact token. These two Shardfall tokens are used by certain Ploy cards found in this extra pack included in the game. There are also rules for multiplayer games of 3 or 4 players, but I'll leave all of this for you to discover on your own. Otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play Warhammer Underworlds Shadespire. If you have any questions, though, about anything that you saw here, don't hesitate to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.